Good morning.
Good morning.
Thought I'd start out in tweed just to emulate Brennan as best I could. And it's too hot for this, so I'm actually going to take it off. And that was my one shot at professorial. So this morning we're talking about Incarnation and the Liturgy. Everybody, we're all aware of that, right? Yeah. So a story, and then we'll jump right in. And the story is of a Louisiana Catholic, Roman Catholic young man. He was on retreat with about 120 Episcopalians. So he was new to the culture. And we had celebrated a Holy Eucharist in the old dining hall at Camp Michael. Anybody ever been to the old dining hall in Camp Michael? It's a very homey place, and lots happen. A lot happens up there, and it's sort of a centered place of worship in the Diocese of Atlanta for young people. The chapel up at Camp Michael is largely ignored, but the dining hall is where it all happens, and it becomes, the old dining hall becomes that makeshift work space, and I use that as allegory and metaphor, so just sort of bracket that as a prospect for how we understand our liturgical life in relation to the Incarnation. So we celebrate a Eucharist, and we use a big loaf of bread, of course, from the dining hall, and guess what happens? As we break the bread and distribute it to people, crumbs. Yeah, altar guild people are like, crumbs, oh, crumbs. So yeah, lots of crumbs because it's a big baked loaf of bread from the dining hall, and the priest is messy. I wasn't the priest. And it just goes everywhere, and 120 kids are being communed, and so you're just ripping off big shreds of this, and bread's everywhere. And so we conclude the Eucharist, the distribution of the Eucharist, and we're sort of reassembling, and it takes a while to get youth back to their places and all that sort of business. And I'm kind of doing a backpedal as I'm looking at the crowd going back over to the altar, which is behind me, and I bump into something and I almost trip over. And it's this young guy from Louisiana. He's down on all fours, and he's meticulously using his finger to get crumbs of bread. And I look at him and go, "What are you doing?" Because, I almost embarrassed myself by tripping backwards over him. And he goes, I'm, indignant and sort of mildly apoplectic that I don't understand what he's doing. He looks at me and goes, "I'm getting the crumbs." And I'm like, "Why?" And all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, God, oh. It's like, you got to get up, I mean, people are going to understand what's happening, and, you got to, it's okay. God's going to take care of God's self. I didn't say that out loud. But, so we got him up off the ground, and we sort of made some peace around that. What was at stake in that for him as a good Roman Catholic? Why was that perplexing? Yeah, another Roman Catholic's going to write. It's the real body, yeah. And so in Roman Catholic theology for hundreds of years now, it's been doctrine that in the bread and wine there is the actual real substance. It becomes the real substance of body and blood. So that's preface to our conversation this morning about incarnation in our liturgical life. That undoing that. So there's. Does anybody know the technical terms for what's at stake? Transubstantiation. What's the alternative? Consubstantiation. Okay, so the Lutheran alternative, and we'll get there. We're jumping ahead here, but consubstantiation is what the Lutherans sort of held as an alternative to transubstantiation. Transubstantiation being the transference, if you will, the transition, the transmorgification of bread and wine into body and blood. Consubstantiation being something that cohabits in the bread and wine, the real presence. So it's not an outward veritable truth that the bread and wine become body and blood, but the body and blood cohere, if you will, with bread and wine. And that's sort of a Lutheran alternative. I want to suggest an Anglican alternative by the end of the hour. Yeah, of course, right? there's always an Anglican alternative. Yeah.
In this class, the very dawn of Episcopalians, that they left it open and said it's not completely wrong. Or did I get that wrong? Or that's what we're going
Well, we'll see. Yeah, the dawn of Episcopalians. I like that. The dawn of Episcopalians. If we could locate that point in time, we'd be doing well. But yeah, so we'll tease that out a little bit and see where we go. So let's back it all the way up to the beginning. And where is that beginning? Where would we locate the beginning of an idea of incarnation in the bread and wine? What are the precursors to that actually? Where does
The Last Supper.
Oh, okay, so the Last Supper. And where does the Last Supper? There's something even before the Last Supper. What predates the Last Supper? What was Jesus doing in the Last Supper?
Passover.
It was a Passover meal. It was a Seder, right? And so part of the ritual life of the Jews, and this is the culture that Jesus was born into. It was his culture. It made total sense to him at that Passover moment to say words of thanksgiving, words of proclamation, words of connection to the bread and the wine. That's what Jews had been doing for a couple hundred years in their liturgical life. They've been saying, for this bread we give thanks, O God. It's the fruit of the earth, and it sustains our lives, right? So there's already a culture around bread and what bread did in the Jewish community. In Passover, God says, do it quick, right? Because there's urgency to the Exodus. There's urgency to getting out of Egypt. And so you take the unleavened bread because you don't have to cook it long. It's a quick thing. And you stick it in your bag and you head out the door after you've hurriedly eaten that roasted lamb. Not boiled, but roasted. Recipes are important to God. And that matters. You can quote me on that. That's the Anglican version. So that's an important backdrop. The wine then, too, right? Because at the Passover, Jesus holds up the cup of wine and says, blessed is the fruit of the vine. What does the wine do? Bread sustains. What does wine do?
At the Seder, there's a lot of ritual around dipping your finger into the wine 7 times or 9 times, and each time you're supposed to remember a different horror story in Judaic history of a time that God has come and protected the Jews and saved the Jews.
Yeah.
Tasting their sorrow each
Yeah. And so there's an intimate connection with grief and sorrow. Not too big a leap to kind of make that step to blood, right? I mean, if you're connecting to your griefs and sorrows, and that's the stuff that beats in your heart. It's blood, and it's also celebratory as well. It's vindication of the Jews. It's Exodus. It's new life, and so it's the wine that gladdens our hearts, right? So that's all part of it. That's the milieu that Jesus is born into and that he's celebrating at the Passover meal. So it's not a huge stretch to kind of go, with the words. What are the words that Jesus utters around the bread and the wine?
This is my body.
This is my body, right? This is my blood. Where do we first see that in the New Testament? Even before the Gospels. This is where the story really begins for us as Christians, right? So we have the backdrop of Judaism and the Seder meals and the Sukkot meals, and Sukkot being a sort of a word that associates with Eucharist, Thanksgiving, blessing. We're talking about the blessings of the wine and the bread. Where do we first see it in the New Testament? Those words of institution. Those are important words.
Paul somewhere.
Yeah, Paul in 1 Corinthians. Right? So in 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians were a group of people, Corinth, of course, that were struggling to sort of identify, if you will, their ritual life. There was a lot going on in Corinth. And the stuff that was going on was all about sort of ecstatic religious experience. That's where Paul writes to the Corinthians and says, look, if all this speaking in tongues stuff, just settle down, relax. I'd rather have one person speak a word that everybody can understand than to speak 10,000 words in a language that no one can understand. So he's trying to push back on their ecstatic religious experience. And people are coming to the temple, the rituals of the temple, and getting drunk and eating too much and expecting that what had already become in the first 20, 30 years after Jesus, what had already become a ritual experience for the nascent Christian church, they were already starting to see abuses of that. And so Paul was trying to push back on that. He was saying, look, don't come to this meal thinking you're going to get full and satisfied. Some of you are just eating like pigs. Stop it. And others of you are all worried about food sacrificed to idols and all this kind of stuff. So he's trying to define something for the early Christian church. And he says, on the night Jesus died, he took this and he said, this is my body. So he's trying to inculcate the early church with a sense of reverence around this ritual act that had been part of Judaism but was getting a little squirrely in this Hellenistic experience that the Corinthians were having, right? So early on, we see Paul trying to lay down some road work for this idea of Eucharist and this Jewish meal, this Jewish Thanksgiving around bread and wine. And so he quotes Jesus. Paul's before the Gospels. And so it's reasonable to presume that that was floating around in the Christian community in the oral tradition. You know, when they got together, it's fair to presume that what they did was say, hey, remember, and remember is an important word in terms of Eucharist, remember what Jesus told us to do. Thank God for the bread. And remember what he said? He said, this was my body. Right? So they're already infusing this ritual experience with a new theological notion about Jesus and what he meant to them. So early on in the early church, we get a sensibility of that. There's different paths that it starts to take. So that's Corinthians and the other Gospels. What Gospel doesn't have, and this is an interesting alternative, what Gospel doesn't have words of institution? Yeah, John.
It's a wild guess.
Yeah. What does John do at that moment in the narrative? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all talking about the Lord's Supper and Eucharist and all that kind of stuff. What's John doing with his narrative of Passover?
Washing feet.
Washing feet.
Praying for them.
Yeah, and praying for them. He's got this big, long-winded prayer that goes on for, seems like chapter after chapter. We call it the high priestly prayer. If I'm in you, you're in me, and we're all in God, and we're, it's all this big, weird kind of thing. So John's washing feet. John has Jesus washing feet, which is sort of an interesting incarnational addendum to our ritual life. We only reenact that how often in the Christian experience? Once a year, on Maundy, Thursday. Yeah, a lot of people sort of reflect on that during that time and kind of think, what if we'd taken John's notion of Passover and washed feet every week? A lot of work for the altar guild. A lot of different kind of work for the altar guild. Be a whole different enterprise. But it's an interesting sort of alternative, if you will, to an incarnational theology around God's presence. And that's what we're after when we talk about incarnation and our liturgical life in some respects, right? Is how are we understanding God's presence with us? So it's not by accident that we use that term as a double entendre here. The real presence of God in Eucharist. How do we understand God's presence in our liturgical and ritual life? Does that make some sense? So John's washing feet as an alternative to that story. One of the next things that crops up in the early Christian church in terms of a notion about Eucharist? Anybody? Any guesses? It's a first century document. It's called the Didache. So most scholars locate it in the first century. Some push it a little bit later. But it's basically an instruction manual, a catechumenate manual that dates, most folks would say, first century. And the essence of it is to give instruction around how to do baptism, how to do Eucharist, and how to treat traveling and itinerant preachers. That's my favorite part of it, because I just want to read you this because it's funny. There's teachings, sort of talks about. Okay, so my child, thou shalt remember day and night him who speaks the word of God to thee, and thou shalt honor him as the Lord. For where the Lord's nature is spoken of, there he is present. Interesting sort of tip of the hat towards an incarnational presence in the priest already. But then it goes on. Hold on a second. Okay, so this is number 7 among the many the pieces. It says, "Do not test or examine any prophet who's speaking in a spirit, for every sin shall be forgiven, but this sin shall not be forgiven." So that absolves preachers of any kind of criticism, right? Let's see. But no prophet. Let's see where to go. Oh, okay. So this is down further down. It's a big long document. It says, "If he who comes is a traveler, help him as much as you can, but he shall not remain with you more than 2 days. or if need be, 3. I just love that as an early instruction to the church. It's like, look, don't put up with these people, send them on their way, be nice, be hospitable, but, urge them on their way. So it's full of those things. It's about 5 pages of instruction, but embedded in that instruction is some simple reminders about how to do baptism and Eucharist. So our liturgical scholars in the church point at this document as evidence that these are the 2 sort of ritual things that are going on in the life of the early church, first century, right? And so Paul gives us that evidence. The gospel gives us that evidence that what was going on was baptism and Eucharist as sort of ways to make some coherence in the community, right? If you read Paul's letters, you can kind of get a sense of the difficulty that the church was struggling with to cohere. There was lots of different sort of energies going on all across the Mediterranean basin as Paul, planted churches around. And so he's writing letters to them kind of going, hey, bring it in line. This is the Jesus that we know. This is what God's presence means. And then there's this liturgical life that's evolving in the first century where the Didache speaks to that and says, look, when you do baptism, this is kind of interesting, use cold water. If you can't find cold water, it gets that specific. Use warm water if you have to. If it's not flowing water, you can use still water. If you don't have any still water, you can pour it. So it's giving all these great alternatives. And of course, the Episcopalians take the pouring method. It's like, and it's warm. So we're breaking all the rules of the first century church. And same thing with Eucharist. It says when you're doing Eucharist, say these words that Jesus said. This is my body. This is my blood. So early on, you're getting an instruction in the early church about the ritual life. Why does that matter in terms of what's the church besides coherence, besides a ritual coherence? What else is at stake in the mind of the early church that Eucharist is speaking to? What's at stake? What was the trauma of the early church? Who's missing from the early church experience? Keeping Jesus present, right? Jesus died, was presumably resurrected, and then ascended. He's gone. And so, this new religion, this new religious experience is kind of gone, how do we understand where Jesus is?
The church is the body.
Well, so I think that's going to come a little bit later, Phil. Yeah. So and you're already hinting at an Anglican understanding of the real presence, which is a little different than what was going on in the early experience of the church as a whole, I think. So yeah, church's body, and Paul certainly alludes to that as well. In Corinthians, in fact, right? Corinthians chapter 12, he says. So he goes from Eucharist to that body imagery. That's kind of interesting that you bring that up at this point. Yeah, Bob.
Time is the thing that has been dealt with. A consistency across time was accomplished in 390. And that was to make it congruent and equal. Whatever the sources, they all come together and say, this is how you do it.
In terms of creeds?
Yep.
Uh-huh. Yep. So there's that movement. And so for the first 325 years of church life, pre-Constantine, right? Constantine, we marked that at around that time when the church went from house church and subversive to imperial and institutionalized. So before that, there's no recorded liturgy that has any sense of the words of institution. We get these precursors in the Didache and in Paul and the Gospels, and there's even some folks that write about it. Justin writes about it. Tertullian writes about it in the middle of the 2nd century, and commending this to be done, implemented. There's a quote from Tertullian that's kind of nice. And Tertullian, if you don't know, is the guy that talked about the Trinity. Later on, he sort of helped develop the notion of the Trinity. So this is about 200 AD. Tertullian writes, having taken the bread and given it to his disciples, he made it his own body by saying, this is my body, that is, the figure of my body. A figure, however, there could not have been unless there was first a veritable body. An empty thing, or phantom, is incapable of a figure. If, however, as Marcion might say, he pretended the bread was his body because he lacked the truth of bodily substance, it follows that he must have given bread for us. So you can already see sort of Tertullian deeply embedded in trying to define Jesus' person over and against some heresies and stuff. And so in a philosophical category, what are we broadly talking about? If we're talking about substance and bodies and things, what's that categorically in philosophy?
Time forces drifting.
Not quite where I was going, but I was thinking more in terms of ontology. That's sort of the philosophical category. Ontology is the study of things and substance and stuff. Brendan's been talking about that, you know, in the ancient world of the Jews and early church, where stuff sort of fit into the religious mindset of the day. And so here's Tertullian writing in 200 AD, talking about the necessity of Jesus' real body in order for it to have this substantive capacity in bread and wine. He's making a philosophical argument already for real presence in bread and wine based on the prima facie argument that Jesus was a real person. We're already 200 years in, right? This is like us standing around kind of talking about George Washington and going, well, did he really chop down the cherry tree? You know, what, was it a real axe? Was it, you know, he was a real guy, right? We can all be sure that, you know, his face is on the dollar bill, you know, so we can be pretty certain, you know, so there's a lot of speculation 200 years in about this person. There's some other shadowy figures that we could sort of, you know, if we had less written material about Washington, less historical stuff, it'd be a lot more speculation. So Tertullian is suggesting to the church, this is about real stuff, right? What does that do to our theological thinking? Why does that matter? So it matters in terms of the early church's ritual experience of Jesus and kind of going, let's locate our God with us, right? We want God with us. That's one thing that's at stake. But what else is at stake? If Jesus has a real body. Yeah.
Well, Brendan had been talking about how there were a couple of different creation stories. One, God is distant, speaks to the world. The other one, God is in the world and actually forms the man out of clay. So this brings us back to that more primitive understanding of God, I guess.
God's immanent as opposed to transcendent. And Christian theology has always struggled with that. God's immanence in things versus God above things, transcendent. And so we're trying to find that intersection, right? And sometimes the celebration of Holy Eucharist is pointed in that direction. Our narrative in Holy Eucharist talks about the transcendence of God, and then this interruption, if you will, in the transcendence with the imminent injection of Jesus into things by becoming human. That's the ultimate sort of iconic gesture of God to kind of go, I'm in stuff. Look, I'm in humanity. Here I am, right? So that's part of what matters too. It's not just where did Jesus go, although that's a very important question for the early church. Where is Jesus? How do we locate Jesus? Right? God. But further and deeper and more philosophically inclined, if Jesus inhabits a real body, then this stuff we got on the table, which is to say our gifts, right? We call them gifts, of bread and wine, just ordinary stuff, is holy stuff. And where do we go with that holy stuff? So here's to Phil's point. Where do we go with that holy stuff?
We consume it.
Yeah, so what happens to that holy stuff?
Becomes part of us.
Becomes part of us, yeah. That, to my mind, and we'll get there in a minute because there's a couple other historical pieces to play with, but that, in my mind, is where our modern theological thinking around Eucharist leads us to an Anglican understanding of Eucharist. to where we find the real presence, right?
You know, if you look through the ages, right, and
Uh-huh.
prehistoric, and we can see it today, you go to cave and you find symbols,
Yeah.
right? So I think we as humans, we always like symbols.
Uh-huh.
And when you were talking about that, that to us, the bread, the wine, is a symbol that we put a value, an emotion,
Yeah.
a relationship, right? The
Yeah.
same way that those old folks did on the wall,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So
And there's-
it's about symbols, you know,
Yeah.
meaning something to us.
So you're on the Lutheran slash end of the consubstantiation end of the spectrum. That's kind of the Lutheran push, the Protestant push, is to
Do I
see it
have to leave the
symbolically.
church now?
No. So here's the fun of being Episcopalian: you can think whatever you want to about this, and you're good. You're in. Just as long as you're thinking. So you bring up an 8th century watershed, if you will, in the history of thinking around Eucharist. And it's these two guys named Retranmus and Redbertus. I get their names confused all the time because they sound so much alike. And one was pupil and one was student. And just so that I get it right, I'm going to refer to my notes. So 8th century characters. And so Redbertus was the transubstantiationist, and Retranmus was his student. He was the consubstantiationist, and this was about 850. They were a teacher and pupil, and so one of them talked about the necessity. So this is the first time we have an articulation, right, in theological thinking, 800, 850, that in the bread and wine. We have they have a need to see that as the real presence, that becomes body and blood, and that becomes an important watershed moment, because the counterpoint to that is the consubstantiationist argument, which is it just symbolizes. So this went on from 850 to 1250, so roughly 500 years, right? 400 years before it was codified in official doctrine of the church. So 1,200 years of Roman Catholic liturgical life and experience before, at the Lateran Council, it became codified as doctrine. 400 years between Retranmus and Redbertus's argument before it became codified as doctrine. That's a long time. That's a long time to let it sort of sit in the murk, if you will, and let it stew.
Codified as transubstantiation?
For the Roman Catholic tradition, yeah. And it gets reiterated in 1600 at the Council of Trent. In the 16th century? What's going on? 1550. What's happening on the continent of Europe at that time? Yeah. There is a religious revolution going on the continent, and Luther's pushing back on the idea of transubstantiation. It's a wonderful argument. I mean, consubstantiation is kind of like, it's not binary in a way, right? Which is kind of nice. It's quantum. It's not that it's bread and wine or body and blood. It's that it's bread and wine and body and blood and both and the same. That's quantum, right? It's not that it's 0 or 1. It's 0 and 1 at the same time. That's kind of an interesting sort of Episcopal, Protestant notion is that we want our cake and we want to eat it too.
Why, listen to me there, you were saying that, why we go through those arguments?
Well, so we're gonna get there, right? So the modern theologians are gonna get us there. But before we do that, what are some of the problems inherent if we stay with a transubstantiaistic vantage point on Eucharist? What are some of the liturgical ritual problems inherent in that? What's gonna be questioned?
Well, you have to pick up the crumbs.
Okay, crumbs on the floor. Yeah. So we got to figure out what we're going to do with the crumbs on the floor, and which is an important question. So in the Roman Catholic tradition, who eats the crumbs on the floor?
The priest.
Yeah. So we're getting to one of the significant problems in the Roman Catholic calculation of transubstantiation. What's at work in that? What's at work in the priest being the person that has to eat the crumbs off the floor.
The priest is also the person who makes it happen.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
conduit, or,
Yeah.
it
So-
elevates them to a much different level.
Yeah, so all of a sudden, because of our yearning and our want to understand God's presence in our ritual life and locating God's presence in the body and blood and trying to figure out the mechanism for that location, we get an elevated role for clergy because they're actually conduit or performer or exalted magician, the hocus pocus,
All of the
right?
above.
All the above, right? Start to kind of scooch their way into the argument, and it's a sidebar, interesting sidebar that gets pushed. Well, and why can't we have women? and say more. Why does that matter if we're talking about transubstantiation, consubstantiation, body and blood, real presence?
Because you're eating a man.
There you go. Okay. Sounds kind of racy the way you say that, Phil.
So the idea is that only a man has the magic power to make this happen.
Well, so it begs those questions, doesn't it? That's part of what's problematic about the Roman Catholic ecclesiology that sort of attends the Roman Catholic theology of Eucharist in real presence. If you're going to have, all the way back to Tertullian in the 2nd century, right? He goes, hey, it's a veritable body. It's a real body. Jesus was like this. This is the way Jesus looked. And so if Jesus looked this way and we locate real presence in bread and wine based on that body, then maybe the body that's performing this miracle of changing bread to wine, bread to body and wine to blood ought to be the same too. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe, and so it all gets all kind of tied up and irretrievably embedded in gender identity and power and control. I mean, suddenly priest is wildly in control, right, of your grace and your access to God. So we've lost our way in some respects, locating the presence of God, because suddenly the presence of God is at the beck and call of priest and not
But also, I'm not sure, is it true at this time that not everybody even could partake of the Eucharist, only certain people in the, it wasn't for everybody.
right.
Even all the men, that is.
Still isn't.
Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody recently who went to a Roman Catholic funeral, and there was the no mistaking announcement: if you're not Roman Catholic, please don't come up to communion. They were devastated by that because the person that had died was a close personal friend. They had left the Roman Catholic Church for many years, but family culture and all those expectations being what they were buried from the Roman Catholic place, and they were just like, what a devastation, right? So that's still true, Martha, and even more so in the Middle Ages. I mean, you had to purchase your way out
There were a
of.
few people, I think, at that time in the church.
Yeah. I mean, when I was. Emily's mother was Roman Catholic, and in college when we were dating, I went to church with her family, and I was sitting on the aisle side of the pew, and dopey me sitting right there next to 5 very devout Roman Catholics, and the Eucharist starts and whatever, the invitation to come up for communion, and I pop into the aisle and I just walk on down, and I'm waiting in line and stuff, and people are filing in behind me and stuff, and I presume it's them, and I turn around, I'm like, strangers, and then I look over my other shoulder, and they're all sitting in the pew just like, it's like, who is that guy? And I'm like, oh, what the hell? I go up and take communion. And I come back and I was still ignorant. I was like, why didn't you guys go to communion? And they're like, none of us went to confession. I was like, what? Being the absurd Protestant that I am. But control. So the church, and there's good arguments that you could say, oh, this starts with Constantine and the imperialization of the church and the want to, control real presence. So what does that begin to say about the human condition and when I say Roman Catholic and we're talking historically, that's our heritage too. So I'm not trying to cast stones at Roman Catholicism modern version. I'm talking historically, and so there's a moment of departure from that in Anglican history, but it's our collective history. What are some of the inherent problems around human being, the theology of human being, that are cognates to this problem with priesthood and consubstantiation, real presence? What's the
That's a lot of big words, I don't know what you're.
well, so what's at stake if we start to locate real presence in bread and wine, and that real presence is ginned up by whatever the priest might do, and there's control there, etc., and the priest has to be male, and a facsimile of Jesus and all the rest of that kind of stuff, what do we begin to question about ourselves? Yeah.
I just wonder if it really is a problem, though, if you think about it from the standpoint that God can only reveal himself through human beings. And, it's important in the Roman Catholic tradition that the priest, somebody is going to be up there directing the liturgy. It's going to be a human person. There's no way around that.
So hold that thought, because I want to touch on what Laura said, which was shame, right? Is that the word you used? Worthiness. Okay, so I heard shame. Next page. Anyway, so worthiness and all of the other cognates that go along with worthiness about whether or not we're worthy to stand before God, worthy to receive God. So yeah, I mean, those are the things that the theology drags along. To Paul's point, and so maybe this is highlights the struggle. There's this, so right in between, or right near the time of the Lateran Council, there's this debate in the church about it's in the Latin phrase, I think it's ex operantum, or ex opere operantum, which means out of the operator comes the operation. That's the loose Latin translation. And so the debate was, when a priest is a horrible person, and we all know they've notoriously sinned, does that invalidate the Eucharist? That was a traumatic question in the Middle Ages, because priests were doing all sorts of, and even today, perhaps, yeah. And so we question it kind of semi-consciously, right? This person,
You see it in the news.
Right, yeah. And so so right, we're talking causality and chain of events at this point, right? And so if the priest is a notorious sinner, and the priest is going, this is the bread and body, the body and blood of Jesus, does the notorious sins of the priest invalidate? So it asks that human question, right? Is it through human agency that this happens? Or is it the agency of God? The Catholic Church answered it correctly from my vantage point. It's through the agency of God. It's out of the operation of God's work, not of human work. And so in some respects, it wipes out the necessity of the worthiness of any person standing at the altar. Because on one sense, none of us are worthy, in another sense, all of us are worthy. Right?
So if that's the answer, then why can't we be priests?
Exactly.
Well, yeah. And that was 900 years ago, right? So we still haven't helped our brothers in the Roman Catholic tradition to solve that question. We've been banging on that door loudly for a generation now, which is a good thing.
They move a little slower than
Yeah. But it's an important controversy to kind of throw in there, that sense of where the operation happens, right? And we want to locate, because it gets us to a modern understanding of real presence in Eucharist that Ronner, who's a modern Catholic theologian, sort of articulates a generation ago. Questions so far in terms of sort of the ancient story of Eucharist? Of course, we have the Eucharistic prayers in our prayer book, some of which are any favorites in that department that help you sort of actualize your sense of what Eucharist means to you?
I kind of like C.
You like C? Planets in their courses in this fragile earth, our island home, and the primal elements. Yeah.
We do? Okay.
The primal elements.
We call that the Star Wars.
The Star Wars liturgy, yeah. What else? Who else? Yeah, interesting that in C, we see sort of a hallowing, a blessing, a much broader blessing of all of creation and the cosmos. All of it's in, so that fits into Ronner's sort of philosophical thinking that moves us away from the debates of the ancient church around ontology, right? Ronner's thought was if we can just get away from that notion of whether or not it's real substance in the bread and wine, that's an ancient argument. We don't need to go there. Let's talk about the grace-imbued universe. How do we get in touch with the grace-imbued universe? And that's sort of his notion of things. Any other thoughts on Eucharistic prayers? Which one don't you like? Which ones? Any of them feel more incarnational to you, aside from the C? Can you remember any of them? A is the one we've been doing lately.
I think it's the one that's sort of the most familiar.
Yeah.
But you could
A and B are the two.
pretty much reconstruct.
Yeah. And what are the elements of a Eucharistic prayer that push us toward understanding, or at least the tension of the words of institution? Right? So here are the elements of a Eucharistic prayer. There's the canon of the Eucharist, which is the narrative. Then there's the words of institution. This is my body, this is my blood. Then there's the memorial acclamation, which is the proclamation of the mystery. Right? And then there's the epiclesis, which is calling down of the Holy Spirit on these gifts to make them the bread or the body and blood of Jesus. Those are sort of the elements of it. In the canon of the Eucharist, in the narrative of the Eucharist, what are we doing? What story are we telling? So Martha's already illuminated that for us in Prayer C. We're talking about sort of the hallowedness of all creation, which changes the argument about the debate around the ontology of bread and wine right out of the gate, I hope. What else is at work in the narratives of Eucharist that tease out some of the tensions of incarnation in our liturgy?
It's the separation. We've fallen away, and
Yeah.
so it's bringing us back.
Yeah. What's bringing us back?
Well, the life of Christ, the life of Jesus.
Yeah. And so take that another step further.
And his death.
And who is that guy? That Jesus.
The anointed one.
Yeah. Okay. So the Christ, right? The one to save.
Mm-hmm.
And that's you've done a fine Anglican job of resisting labeling it any further than you did. But yeah, so he's the anointed one. And so our Eucharistic story talks about God's anointed one, the Savior, the Messiah, God's Son, God incarnate, right? Those are all sort of pieces that we put into the dance of the narrative of Eucharist that sort of push us to this place of kind of going, what are we doing with this bread and this wine? That's the apex moment of Eucharist, right? I remember I was doing a summer camp, another camp story. The camp director had left, and so there was great heartbreak among the senior high crowd because they'd grown up with this camp director. He'd been beloved, and there was a new guy, and nobody liked him. That's the way it goes. It's like, oh, the new guy, it's such a drag. And so a bunch of kids had sort of petitioned the clergy, I was among them, that we had to do something, to laud and glorify this, and it was the slideshow. And they wanted the slideshow to be the centerpiece of the last night. We want to weep and cry about what has been and what we've lost and all this kind of stuff. And so my friend was like, what do I tell these kids? And they think that's the most important part of the week of camp. And emotionally, perhaps it was. And I was sort of being glib, and I was like, you tell them that the fraction is the most important part of the week at camp. And so he did. This group of kids that come in, he's like, the fraction's the most important part of the week at camp. And they're all just kind of going, what? The what? But it's that, that moment of breaking bread, right? That's behold the breaking of the bread. Behold the Christ, behold the what? What else is in that moment?
That harkens back to the crucifixion, the body broken.
Okay, yeah.
It sacralizes that horrible time and makes it and holds it up.
Yeah. Laura?
The connection.
Yeah.
It's the umbilical cord.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. A very incarnate image of body connection, of blood and guts, of the difficulty of life. We don't lift up a whole body, we lift up a broken body. That's a pretty profound moment in terms of our capacity to identify and connect in the body, incarnationally, with God. So an Anglican notion of that gets us away from the debate of consubstantiation and transubstantiation, offers another piece into that debate. Doesn't get us away from it, just offers us another piece to that debate, which is phenomenological in Ronner's terms, or existential. What happens in Eucharist? Describe the story. After the fraction, what happens and to the real presence? We've already talked about it. We ingest it. Phil suggested early on, we become the body. Where do you locate that in other places in the liturgy most? Go ahead.
In the post-communion prayer.
Okay. Say more about that.
Well, you're taking the body and then you go forth into the world.
Yeah.
Being represented as the agent, the hands, the feet.
And so what then can we begin to say about the real presence of God in our lives and in the world? Where does God reside? Yeah. And so where's the sort of back to the Didache and the instruction manual on how we're supposed to live our lives and all that, the rest of that kind of stuff? What's our instruction manual to actualize that sense, aside from the post-Eucharistic prayer? That's sort of a glimpse, a small codex, if you will, of the larger theological way in which we live this out liturgically. What's the other great sacrament of the church? Baptism. Yeah? So how about the baptismal covenant as that instruction place, that ritual place, where we begin to actualize a whole different notion, an existential notion of the real presence of God? Where do we begin to see it existentially? Do you recall the baptismal covenant? What's the first thing in the baptismal covenant? There's purpose to this. What's the first thing?
It's all the we believe stuff, and then it's
Well,
what we're going to do.
so yes, it's the we believe stuff, and then we say,
Continue in the breaking of the bread. and
we will
prayers.
continue in the breaking of bread and the prayers, in the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread and the prayers. So the apostles' teaching is a direct reference. The Didache is teaching, right? That's the apostles' teaching. That's the early church document about doing Eucharist and baptism, and in the prayers. We give thanks to God for this bread. We give thanks to God for this wine. It doesn't say Eucharist per se. It just says in the prayers. And so it helps us already begin to locate a real presence of God in our daily life.
Share with us in this.
Yeah.
Respect the dignity of
So, well, before we get there, what happens next in the cycle of the baptismal covenant? It's a beautiful incarnational human moment, and it begs the question of how we understand God's presence in human beings. Whenever you fall into sin, this isn't something that Episcopalians do well, but whenever you fall into sin, will you repent and return to the Lord, right? So it presumes, and we're going to fall into sin, so it helps absolve us right out of the gate of that 12th century conundrum of whether or not it's the efficacy of the person standing at the altar that makes Eucharist real or not, right? Whenever you fall into sin, presumes that even the priest is in that place. And it also presumes that God's going to go, oh, welcome back. It's so good to see you again. You know, you're welcome here. Come on back to this. Then the third part is, and it's starting to get more incarnational as we go along, right? Not quite. Will you proclaim the good news of God in Jesus Christ? And how do we do that best?
Through your actions.
Yeah, which is to say,
Through your life.
through your life. So we're getting deeper and deeper into an incarnational theology of Eucharist, right? If we're taking in bread and wine and we're saying this is God, then God's residing in here. The best way I know to proclaim God, it's a fun thing to ask parents in a baptismal seminar. How do you proclaim the good news of God in Jesus Christ? They always have the shiny penny answer. It's like, you do good things and you be a good person and whole high level great stuff, which is great stuff sometimes, when we do it. The problem is that we don't always live there, right? And in a Jungian archetype, it is as important in the proclamation of the good news of God in Jesus Christ that we get in touch with our brokenness. That's part of what's celebrated. We're celebrating a brokenness. That's incarnational. That's to welcome brokenness into the doors of the church. It's not to say, oh, you have to qualify first, right? You have to confess your sins first. We already know you guys are sinners. You're welcome at the altar. I'm just teasing. That was it. So the next part, what comes after that proclamation in the body of the good news of God, Jesus Christ? What's the next part? Sarah.
Oh, yes, seek and serve.
Okay, there you go. So then it gets just demonstrably overt. We're going to seek and serve the Christ in all people. So it's not just, and so here comes our sacramental theology to visit the theology of Eucharist. And our sacramental theology is the overlay of a theology of Eucharist. If bread and wine if there's the real presence of God in bread and wine, and we're ingesting that and going out into the world with it to proclaim the good news of God in Jesus Christ, and part of that proclamation is that we seek and serve Christ in all people, what are we doing as Christians? Sacramentally, outward and visibly, that is a holding place, a marker of an inward and invisible truth. What are we doing? We're placeholders for...
We're doing sacrament. We're giving the body of Christ again in some ways.
We're not just giving it, but we're living out the truth that God is in all people, right? Sacramentally, we're outward and visible signs that God is present in everybody. That's the work of our Eucharist. We go out into the world not to convert anybody. I don't have to convert Bob. What I have to do is witness my own conversion at the revelation of God in Bob. As difficult as that may be sometimes. Right? Oops. And so we become sacramental entities as we go out into the world, living this notion that God's in us simply for it to be a reflexive action and go, oh, and God's in you. That's where our covenant's taking us, to that deeply incarnational place where Eucharist is simply a dress rehearsal for what we're going to live out in the world. And then comes our ethical mandate as a result of that dress rehearsal of how we live out in the world. And what's the ethical mandate? Yes?
Oh, I mean, I don't mean this really seriously, but if you're going to be very legalistic, if you see this person in the street and know that he's never taken communion, how can God be in him?
Yeah, right. Well, so that's the sacramental question at stake, isn't it? Yeah, and it's not too far away to do the regression back to a place where the Roman Catholic Church would qualify the presence of God for you based on doctrine and their rendering of your worthiness. That would be my answer to that question. The other way is a progression rather than a regression, right? And the progression is, oh, God's in me, surprise, surprise. God's in you, God's in her, and I don't even know her. Or she's Muslim, or she's Buddhist, or she's agnostic.
I'm not saying
God's
this,
in that
so I
person.
was just wondering if Eucharist is necessary to transfer God into you, how do the people
No.
know?
Yeah, and so I get your question now, and I would say no, because what's at work in sacrament is a statement of something that is real, regardless. Here's the sign that points at a reality, right? And so the sign of bread and wine coming into me points at the reality that God's in me.
So it's like the Protestant Revolution,
Reformation.
Thank you, that said, you are not saved by your faith. Your faith enables you to see that you are saved.
I would agree with that. That it's about a revelation, a self-revelation of sorts. Yes. It's about my awareness rather than about a transaction
And then when
that
you
has to
become aware
occur.
that you are part of God, then you
Yeah,
want
Yeah.
to act that way.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. Yeah. And so fundamentally I would say there are no transactions for God. And that's a whole other theological question. But the ethical mandate of the baptismal covenant is what? And then we'll wrap it up.
That's to respect the dignity of every human
Respect the dignity of every human being and work for justice and peace. That is our simple ethical mandate as Christians, deeply rooted in a sense of incarnation, of God's presence in the world. If we agree that the Christ is out there, then by God we better gear up for the work of justice and peacemaking, to welcome that Christ, to be accessible to that Christ. And we can't do it without justice and peacemaking. We just simply can't do it. And we're certainly not going to do it by by offering an alternative ethical mandate based on my version of a piety. Of a piety, of a way I understand holiness. Does that make some sense? Well, this has been fun, y'all. I know it's late, and so I hope it's an adequate interjection of our liturgical sense of incarnation and Eucharistic theology with a splash of baptism. Enjoyed it.
Thanks.